So, hi, folks. I'm glad y'all could join us today. This is a discussion. It's a fireside chat with some really brilliant technologists in the open source community. And what we're really going to talk about is how ecosystem has changed the nature of how we approach open source projects and how we approach actually working together. Open source is collaborative by nature. So with me, I've got Robert, Matt, and Steve. And let me ask each of y'all to give just a quick introduction, your company, what you do, and why you care. So Robert, let's start with you.
Thank you. My name is Robert Sirchia. I'm a technical evangelist at SUSE, and my job is to help bridge the gap between community and our technologies.
Yep. Matt?
Yep, I'm Matt Butcher. I'm the CEO of Fermion. I've been doing open source since the 90s, and that carries on into today.
And Steve?
Hey, so my name's Steven Chin. I work for JFrog, and we're everything DevOps to get to your deployment. And I've been doing an open source developer for many years, and I run the developer relations team at JFrog and a bunch of our open source efforts, like the Conan package manager for C and C++, and our new Persia project, which we're launching.
Cool. And just to finish this off, I'm Dave McAllister. I'm the open source evangelist for NGINX across the board. And I'm one of the few people in the world who've been doing open source longer than Matt. So yeah, literally I've been doing it before it was called open source. And I remember when it was discussed in Larry Agassi's office at 100 Hamilton in Palo Alto. So let's kind of kick this off with something, because we are talking about open source here. And, if I go far enough back, open source actually kind of started as a bunch of individual efforts. It really was an individual itch to scratch here. You can think Samba, you can think Linux, you can think GIMP, but the world has changed, and now we've got all these other surrounding technologies around here. And I'm going to pick on a couple here. We have OpenTelemetry, near and dear to my heart, but it also attaches Prometheus, it attaches to Grafana. We have Kubernetes, which attaches to Helm. So, I'd love to get a discussion around what's changed in the world to make us now all have to work with all these different projects together. And Matt, since you had a small deal to deal with Helm back in the day here, let's start out with you. What's changed in the world to bring these technologies together?
I actually love this question, because I think, if we rewind all the way back to the kernel days and the Samba days and things like that, what we were seeing in those kind of early collaborative stages was, first of all, open source trying to figure out how it was going to work in the first place, but also trying to provide alternatives that would be sort of foundational layer alternatives to proprietary software. And I think TCP/IP stack is a great example of this, right? And once we could start building those foundations, then we started realizing with like GNOME and KDE and Linux distributions, oh, well, if we collaborate a little more on how we're doing open source together, we can build kind of the next layer up. And so to me, when I think of like Helm and Kubernetes, right, I kind of think in terms of layer cakes. We've laid down this foundational layer, then another one, and now we're way, mid-tier maybe, or something like that. But I think that in that process, right, we as practitioners of open source development have really started to understand that that community in open source can be a thing, right? And that in and of itself can lend to being more cooperative, creating more welcoming ecosystems. I feel like for most open source communities, we no longer look at things as strict meritocracy, right? The one who can produce the most amount of code wins. It really seems to be now we understand the role of community managers, we understand the role of developer relations, and all of those things as building up a community where the new person who's never even run the software feels like they can come in and ask that first question to get going. So I think you see both a technical layer cake, but also I think you kind of see a community and outreach sort of layer cake as well.
Robert, I mentioned Linux inside of here as well, but I know SUSE has gone well beyond just a pure Linux environment. So how do you work with other communities outside of your space?
We have to acknowledge that there's other communities, and you can't necessarily shove them all into one bucket and expect the same results. What drives a Linux-based community is not the same that drives a Kubernetes-based community. And within these communities, there's subgroups. And if we can pick on Helm, that's, one particular subgroup. When you go into observability, these are other subgroups. They have different drivers and needs, and we acknowledge those needs, and we work with them to not only perpetuate solving those needs, but to communicate it to other upstream and downstream users in those communities.
Yeah, and Stephen, you follow into that DevRel camp with a lot of open source hands-on experience as well. So, Matt mentioned that we're now very community focused, and we're very, very much a community. So, how does community impact this ecosystem world?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the progression of open source, I remember when open source was kind of a foreign concept to a lot of companies, where they were just trying to figure out how to incorporate or how to start taking advantage of open source software. And now it's just become the norm, right? Like building on top of open source stacks, using open source technologies, frameworks, operating systems is a business requirement. And I think one of the major drivers for that transformation is the power of community and the support that you get from being on top of a platform, which can be supported by community forums like Stack Overflow, like all of the feedback loops you get from GitHub and pull requests coming against big open source projects. And those are actually the best form of support, the best form of security, to make sure that you're running stacks which are open and secure. And that's all because you have a large community, you have a lot of folks who are responding and helping you out, as opposed to like the traditional development model where you have large companies offering paid support and SLAs and all that stuff, which are great, and there's a place for that. But on top of that, you want to know that you're running something which is open, which is well supported by a community. And that's the big shift which we've seen in the industry towards running and being on top of fully open source stacks.
Yeah. That also that leads me into an interesting side channel here is open source has created the concepts of strange bedfellows. 10 years ago, nobody would have ever believed that anything from Microsoft would ever end up inside the Linux kernel. And now Microsoft is one of the biggest contributors to open source projects across the board for here. So when we look at this from a company basis, how do you pick and build an ecosystem of products? Robert, there's lots of Linux distributions here. How do you pick, which companies you bring in to aggregate around your Linux and Kubernetes solutions?
It's acknowledging the fact that you have frenemies in the space and there's common ground. It's almost sounds like tired political discourse, but if we find common ground to work with others that are competing in one area, but we can collaborate in another, and the winners are the end users, right? The community wins in that situation. And that anti-Microsoft mentality that they would never be open source, those days are long gone. And I have discussions with people from competing companies, Red Hat, Canonical, almost on a daily basis. And at the end, what we're looking to do is, where can we work together to solve a particular need? Where does a community need us? And we've kind of broken down those barriers where we can, put together our differences and then focus on where we can, have some wins.
Okay. So Steve, similar question, but once you bring this group of people together, how does it change the sort of the structure of what you can offer as a solution? This one's I had a real trouble trying to phrase this question out here. But if I bring in, I'm pick on NGINX here, I have to bring in Docker, I have to bring in Kubernetes, I have to bring in all these pieces. And then I need somebody to control those pieces. And, we have companies that we work with here. They're probably equal solutions. But how can you make sure that your solution taking to your customer base is the right solution? What do you do to make that test happen?
Yeah, so I think that when you're looking at building out overall solutions which are gonna help customers based on open source software, we're all basically, as companies trying to do the right thing for our customers, for the ecosystems, but then doing it in a collaborative way. So I think more so now than ever before, it's about interoperability between different solutions. It's about figuring out how we can partner and build solutions together. And a key part to interoperability and those partnerships is having open source APIs, building on top of open source stacks. And I think this is one of the big benefits which we all get by building on top of open source frameworks, by deploying to common frameworks like Kubernetes, kind of using a common cloud native pattern for building applications and deploying. And this has been one of the big drivers of the acceleration of open source as well, because now anything which you can build and glue together, you can now deploy technology wise in containers and to a cloud native environment. So this gives you a much broader range of technologies and integrations. And I think getting back to the Microsoft example, you've seen a huge transformation in their business model as they've moved into the cloud space, where they've had to adopt and embrace open source and Linux as a way of deploying, because it's what their customers demanded. So I think that model to become a major player in the cloud market, you need to support open source software, which folks are developing from end to end to build the next generation of applications.
Yeah. So Matt, similar question, but I want to twist it just a little for this, since a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing here. But you've been in spaces that are some of the most complex open source problems. If you look at the Kubernetes world, and it's 833,000 ecosystem members around it. Here, how do you take those ecosystem players and make the word can't be simple, but make an approachable solution for someone?
Yeah, that I think is one of the biggest challenges of open source. And I mean, really, again, kind of delving back into the past, right? Right. Eric Raymond, one of the kind of early minds in open source, used to talk about open source as kind of scratching your own itch and then finding other people who sort of had the same itch and wanted to jump in there and work with you on it. And that's true in a funny sort of way. That's where almost all of the successful projects have come from. Right? The Helm for me is near and dear to my heart. It came because we were trying to figure out a good way to install our PaaS system and onto Kubernetes, and we had an itch and we worked on it, and then it became bigger and greater. And but that growth period from scratching my own itch to kind of creating an environment in which we could all work together on it, that's a big challenge. And we were very intentional in Helm as we got going, and we realized that the snowball was starting to roll down the hill and gather momentum and gather volume, that we wanted to come up with a system we would use to kind of be intentional about community to the same degree that we were intentional about quality of source code and implementing the right features. So we used to talk about a circle model there, where at the beginning of an open source project, there's a small circle of you who are working on something, and you're all facing each other and saying, okay, let's pound out some code. How do we do this? How do we make this happen? How do we solve this problem? But at some point, if you want to make that transition into a community, y'all have to kind of turn around, and instead of looking inward at each other, start looking outward at the people that are starting to gather around you. And we like that, like looking outward thing, because in a way you got each other's backs, right? You're going to defend the decisions that you collectively as a group made when you approach the broader community, and you're going to explain together what you built together. And then you start gathering another concentric ring around you. And if you're doing things well, then at some point, a group of you are going to become sort of that circle that turns back inward and says, all right, time to start working on version 1.3. It's time to start working on version 2.0. While this next concentric ring around you is going to turn around and perform sort of the outward work with the community and begin building deeper and deeper relationships. And we kind of talked in Helm about how ideally we build out concentric rings like that, so that at the end, you have a good, strong core, you have a good, strong inner circle, you have a good, strong outer circle. The part of the trick in there, and I am eventually getting to answer your question. Part of the trick there is saying at some point, right, it's not merely individuals who are using your software, and it's not merely people who are experimenting on a Friday afternoon when they don't have anything to do at work. It's people for whom your software has become mission critical. And as you begin to engage there, then you start understanding as an individual developer what the needs of an organization are, what the needs of an enterprise are. And in that concentric ring model, it becomes a little bit trickier at first to say, okay, we're going to have to pull enterprise developers close into the middle, because enterprise developer always seems like sort of like anathema in an open source project, or at least for someone like me that came through like the Debian world and stuff like that. But over the Helm project and other similar projects, we realized if we can do a good job of that, then you end up just kind of building up this stronger and stronger set of rings to manage the project. And you can incorporate both, like Helm, I think, does a very good job of incorporating both practices that encourage individual developers to come in and kick the tires and then do their first 2-line PR and stuff like that. Good first issue on a GitHub label. Good first issue label in a GitHub issue is a good example of that. But also does a good job of trying to do right by the enterprise, right? And keep very strong stability guidelines where we don't introduce breaking changes in patch releases and minor releases. And we're very forward in communicating when a security issue comes up, because those are the things that enterprises and their customers are going to care more about, but still things you can run well and effectively in an open source community.
Cool. That actually, that kind of leads me to the next point. And I'm going to throw this one towards you, Stephen, here. As part of this progression of projects, both existing projects and new projects, you've got a new project coming out as well for this. We're seeing more, it becomes more of a corporate focus about issuing and delivering open source. So what are we gaining and losing by suddenly having a corporate open source versus this personal itch to scratch open source?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, and this has been a big shift in industry as a lot of open source developers. When I started my first open source project, it was evenings and weekends, working on an IDE project, which I ended up open sourcing from university. And nowadays, a lot of open source developers are paid for, and it's part of their job to develop open source software. And I think it does shift the dynamics of the open source ecosystem a little bit. It also shifts the role which we all have in open source and how we look at open source. But I think this is all in a very positive way. And as an example about this, when you look at hiring and you look at folks entering the computer science industry now, part of your resume is open source software. It's what projects have you contributed to. What open source software do you have in a GitHub repo? How are you contributing to open source? And this makes it very attractive, for example, college students, folks out of university to contribute to open source projects. So a number of the open source projects that I'm on have really awesome contributions from recent graduates and folks in the community who want to get involved in open source. But it also means that it gives you a chance as a developer to prove your mettle, to prove your worth, and to build amazing things which are outside of the scope of your job, but then to make that part of your job. So I think it's a very unique opportunity in our industry to have this open source ecosystem, which is a meritocracy where the folks can be valued based on your contributions to open source. And what this ends up for corporations is now you're building great software, but you're building it with some of the best minds, some of the most passionate people, and the level of quality and the level of discipline of the software goes up as well. So people care a lot about what they publish to open source because it reflects your reputation. You care a lot about the code quality, the code hygiene, the security, the functionality of what you're delivering. And I think this is part of the reason why we all value and are investing in open source as companies, because it gives you the best quality, the most collaborative solutions to address a variety of different business requirements.
Cool. So, Robert, I'm going to throw this one. Y'all have got a number of different projects, but one of the focuses that is very clear that's been in SUSE and other projects around you is in sort of an upstream approach. So, how do you balance upstream versus the desires of a corporation to expand their specific market? Where's the balancing line hit?
Where we're seeing it is our contributions upstream to benefit our downstream projects that we support for our customers and our community. And so when we look back upstream for some of these projects, or if you just look at our projects, a lot of our projects, what they are, Harvester is an amalgamation of a handful of great open source software that we bind together into a hyperconverged infrastructure solution. And I'm not plugging the product, but that's how we are contributing upstream to different upstream projects to make this better, but not only to make our product or project better, but it also makes the upstream project work much better. And that's contribution that we see value in. So when we look at, Cookbook, we are putting, to my knowledge, we are putting PRs against that frequently to make that project better. And we do that with a lot of our upstream. And it's seeing that foundational push. We know if we're investing upstream, that it only makes downstream projects better.
Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna shift a little bit on you, Matt, with this next question. Mainly, Matt and I go back a little bit, so we've worked at a previous company, so I get to pick on Matt a little bit more for this. We've got this corporate view of people contributing from a corporate viewpoint. We have corporate projects that are being led here, but it really does feel like the new thing is we all have to figure out how we build a foundation and how do we make this thing foundation organized inside of here. So why are we all grouping together to build these new things? I'll get to the technology question that I'm dying to get into, but why do we have all of a sudden foundations being the driving force behind our contribution model?
This is the perfect question for me because we started a startup in November, and one of the very first things we discussed was, well, which foundations are we going to join? Right. And we're not like a standards company, and we're not a company in the business of building and selling standards. We're in the business of building and selling, hopefully someday selling software. And so this question really hits home because I think very much in the last maybe 10 years, if I'm being generous, the foundation and the standards body has gone from sort of like the kind of thing we all groan about, right? Oh, well, got to put out an RFC for this thing, to actually a locus of activity around for an ecosystem. And I think, the container world is a great example of this. There are many ecosystems like this, but the container one, because of the time that it matured, right when this kind of mentality was taking place, it serves as a great example where CNCF came in as a body that was there to foster originally Kubernetes growth, right? Mm-hmm. But immediately the people who participated in that early governance body said, okay, well, we can't limit it just to containers and Kubernetes. We've got to look at what people are building with this. So right there, you start to see a change in mentality from promoting a particular niche product or open source project to promoting an ecosystem. And an ecosystem here begins to take the form of like the community that's forming around a particular technology or problem, and then the other companies that are coming in and participating there, and the goals of the end users who come in, and you get sort of this rich, soup of interests that are all trying to collectively say, okay, we have a similar-ish set of problems to solve. We all think that this technology or this family of technology sort of holds the key. How do we together make sure that we're realizing the potential here? And that to us then as a startup, we were saying, okay, we recognize that there are groups of other people out there who have the same interest we do, the same buy-in to the same technologies we do. How do we find those groups and plug in? Because we recognize that it might actually be not just useful for us, but like a crucial life source for us as a startup to get involved in those kinds of communities, because collectively we're gonna do a lot better, right? Again, I'm layer cake today. I think I need to eat some cake or something. But you kind of build these foundations where you say, okay, we've got a common technical goal and a common need for a community to solve these problems, and then all of us really want to get in on that and stand on that same floor and work together on it.
So throwing this one towards you, Robert, similar around the foundations, foundations seem to be sort of a stabilizing influence, but are they making things overly complicated? I was around when CNCF started and around when OpenTelemetry merged between OpenCensus and OpenTracing. And, fast forward from that happening to now, and all of a sudden you look at it open the OTel space, and it's 600 different projects, and all projects own police. So we're actually making things more complicated than we need to, because we've decided to go after this foundational let's raise the tide approach.
No, I don't think it's getting more complex. I think there's more nuances to the picture. So if we take OpenTelemetry and there's 600 projects in there, right? But with that community and that collaboration, a lot of these projects are going to naturally just dry up and go away. We saw that with the container wars between Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry. And
Yep.
It's not a bad thing. It's one of those where, winners will be chosen by the community and they will bubble up. But it doesn't mean that the contributors to the other projects are gone. Their focus might, start narrowing it down into other aspects of that particular subset of that foundational community. So, put the not PCF, but the Cloud Foundry engineers and developers and contributors, they didn't just disappear. They went out to the wind and they started other projects, and it's just natural progression on how we kind of move to an apex, and we solidify on a particular project or product, and we go from there.
Yeah, and Steve, storing this one your way, again, Matt mentioned standards and standards bodies, and we're seeing a lot of standards being embraced by driving open source here. The problem with standards is that they are a common denominator. Are foundations causing us to lose innovative capabilities?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good thought, and when you look at innovation, I think the most innovative technologies are actually, they come out and they're built upon a variety of other technologies which exist today, where you can kind of make that leap using existing technologies and then build the next best solution. And let me give an example of this from one of the projects which we're busy launching at JFrog. So we're building something fairly complicated. It's a decentralized package registry, which will allow us to provide for open source projects a broader and more secure ecosystem for them to distribute open source libraries and binaries. But we're building this upon other technologies which are already out there in the open source space. So we're building this upon Docker and cloud native technologies for the delivery. We're building this around secure build ecosystem. So we're building this around Tecton and some of the new work going on in the CD Foundation on CD events. And we're also basing it upon some modern technologies like peer-to-peer, and for the distributed ledger, using some blockchain technologies, which are also open source. And I think if you look at the sum of the project, all of the parts, they're different open source efforts, they're different foundation efforts. And when you put all these together, you can achieve something more innovative and more groundbreaking than you can simply by starting from scratch. And foundations provide this level playing field for technologies to get out there, to be vetted by multiple companies, and then for kind of it to be a big tent where the best projects can win. Kind of to Robert's example, I think one of the big shifts in how foundations operate now is, rather than restricting the set of projects or trying to drive the set of projects like a standards body would, what they do instead is they embrace competition. They embrace multiple different efforts and ways of solving the same problem. And they let the end users, they let the folks who are going to use the technologies decide, but they do this in a way where they're ensuring that the projects proposed are multi-vendor. It's not a single company proposing it. The projects are well technically vetted, they're secure. So it gives you kind of this level playing field for different competing ideas to come out there, to build upon each other, to create that innovative churn, so that we're getting the best, most advanced innovative technologies, and then driving industry forward. So I think, if anything, the foundational model's proven itself as the best way for us to collaborate and build the next generation of innovation.
Cool. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left, and I'm going to throw my wild card out here because I have my personal opinions around this as well. What technology or project should our listeners go find out about right now? Maybe not necessarily in production use right now, but is going to be really soon now. So, Matt, we've talked a little bit about that. I'm going to throw this one at you first of all. What technology they better get some understanding about?
Oh, I'm undoubtedly WebAssembly is the technology we're looking at. One of the most exciting things that we stumbled across a couple of years ago was, as we were trying to solve problems that we saw cropping up in virtual machines and containers, saying, what is the next wave of cloud computing? We started looking at WebAssembly and went, we could pull this runtime out of the browser, drop it in the cloud, and solve a bunch of problems. So, Fermion, our company, that's our focus, and we're there not because we found a new hammer and we're looking for nails, but because we looked at the problems that we were seeing evolve in the cloud native ecosystem and said, oh, we think that WebAssembly is the perfect fit for the next technology here.
Robert, how about you?
I can't agree more. It's going to be WebAssembly. It's solving problems that we didn't see before. And as Matt said, it's not like we're a hammer looking for a nail. The nails are out there, and it's solving problems. So I would recommend anyone taking a deeper dive. It's in my prediction, it will be our next phase in that cloud shift because of how it operates and how it works. WebAssembly is going to be with the cloud native ecosystem sooner rather than later.
Steve?
So actually, I'm going to throw out a space instead of a technology. And I think, we've been talking a lot about open source. We've been talking about foundations. And I think one of the things which we've all realized over the past year or two is that open source is awesome. It provides the foundation for our projects. Typically, about 80 to 90% of your enterprise software is composed of open source libraries and open source technologies which you're building on top of. And it's also, as a result of that, it's more important now than ever to secure your open source ecosystem because, frankly, as a longtime open source developer, now a developer in developer relations and open source advocate, our whole ecosystem is under attack. So there are supply chain attacks attacking open source libraries, central repositories, and our ability to build secure open source software. And I think one of the most important things for all of us, our companies, for those of us in DevOps or building out secure technologies for our companies, is to make sure we're doing the right things to both secure our enterprise software, but then also contribute to open source projects and the security of those open source projects to help with that. So we're a sponsor of the Open Source Security Foundation, which is contributing to a lot of this. And we're also proposing a project called Sirchia. This is the decentralized package manager I was mentioning earlier, which is also designed to help open source projects with this. And we're currently, actually, the next meeting I'm on is to talk to the CD Foundation about this. So I think that these are all things which we're excited about at JFrog, but I think is super critical for our industry. And we all have a part to help improve not only the open source ecosystem, but to help the security of that so we can all have a secure foundation for our enterprise software.
Yep. And I can't disagree with anything any of y'all have said. I am a deep believer in the fact that WebAssembly, especially when we get to WebAssembly outside of the cloud, is going to actually be really interesting. When it moves out of the browser, life's going to be challenging for here. The Open Software Security Foundation, OpenSSF, is incredibly important. Its mission is very clear and needs to be backed here. But I'm also going to point out that in our world of modern applications with both chaotic and complex behavior between microservices and ephemeral and those serverless type of functionalities, you better be able to see what's going on. So take a look and dive into OpenTelemetry so that you can actually get the data that helps you figure out what went wrong when you didn't know it could go wrong in the first place. So with that, let me sum up here. Thank y'all for joining me today. This has been a fascinating conversation, a deep look into the ways that we can see what's going on in open source environments here and how our world has changed from back in the early days of Linux and GNU C compilers all the way now to our more complex worlds where we're looking at CNCF foundations and OpenSSF, we're driving our security. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of NGINX Sprint, and thanks for joining us today.